Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. Good evening, perhaps. We're here for the lively discussion of, do unmet needs lead to unwanted outcomes? We've got a good group of folks here that I think are prepared to have a truly lively discussion. But since this is a lively discussion, I want to really emphasize that the goal here is to have audience participation. So we hope that you will join in. I'm going to say just a few words to get us started, and also to introduce the participants. We have Kay Zadevsky, from resource sharing librarian from University of Massachusetts Amherst. David Stern, the library director at St. Xavier University. Caitlin, and I'm sorry, Caitlin, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Kenamui, is it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Access Services Librarian at Seton Hall. And I'm Scott Alberg. I'm the COO of Research Solutions, or you might know us by our service name, Reprints Desk. So the goal of the topic is to take a look at what happens when your library doesn't have the resources that your researchers might want. Researchers are by definition curious about what they don't know, but think maybe they should. And so you can imagine, I'm sure you've had the direct experience of their frustration when they're presented with a limited universe of knowledge, limited by what your library subscribes to. Now, those users have many options to access the content that your library doesn't subscribe to. Some of those might be good options. Some of those might be bad options. We're not necessarily here to discuss that aspect of it. But instead, we're here to talk about the challenges that that this presents for libraries. So, to set the stage just a little bit, you may perhaps have seen that there have been a number of studies in recent years regarding the. Sorry, I just realized I'm not using the present mode on my. There we go. You may have seen that there have been a number of studies in recent years looking at what happens to users or what users do when the library doesn't have access to the content that they're looking for. And a very high percentage of users go outside the library to look for that content. Now you might think that that's okay. I know there are a number of librarians who think it's fine for users to find content however they might want to find it. But I think we should acknowledge that this does present a challenge for the library, because it makes it difficult or impossible, as the case may be, for the library to assess what to easily assess what their user demand is. So we're here to dig deeper into that and look at some strategies, some options, some things that are available that you might not be taking advantage of. Both to assess what that demand is, or to look at what the different access strategies might be for those users. So I'm going to turn it over first to David Stern to get the discussion started.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm a library director, so I'm looking at this in terms of making decisions and assessments. And what we know is that if we're going to make evidence-based decisions, we require data on which to make those decisions. And in this case, some of our data is known, but there's a lot of unknowns about user behavior that we actually want to talk about. So the question is, what is knowable and what is not at this point? We know we can measure things like the quality, the use data, the delays that are possible, the priorities between disciplines, and even predictive costs. Those are the kind of things that we know about. But then let's take a look at the behavior of the user. And so under knowable, if integrated, what I'm saying here is there are many ways a user can actually access journal articles without us knowing about it at all. Or if we integrate it into our systems, we can then know about it and count it. Examples are, there's a tool called unpaywall that can be a button on a browser, but the library can embed that into its own system. So we see those paywalls seamlessly, and we can count those kind of interactions. Google Scholar, we can have people coming in through Google Scholar directly to the publisher, but if we put our resolver in there, then we can track the use of materials through Google Scholar. There are the ability to look at what the publisher says people have used, which is often higher than what we know they've come to through the library resolver. So we need to be able to count the difference and say, these people may have come through other pathways, not the library, but we know we're paying for those articles to be retrieved, and we want to count that. And then there's tools like Lean Library, which are put on an individual's browser. Some of those things go through the library, but others don't, and they're direct between the user and the publisher, or the user and the service. And so we want to be able to capture that information if we can. What we can't know about are the many times we know people ask their friends and colleagues for things, what we call wildcat interlibrary loan. That happens a lot for convenience and for other reasons. And then all the browser buttons that are on an individual's tool that we will never know about. Things like the Google Scholar button that just avoids the library completely. So the question then is, there are many kinds of data. How do we look at the data? So if we can go to the next slide, this is the kinds of data that we can use. And then we'll talk a little bit later about the implications of this. So we can look at different types of data. The packages we know, we can look at in terms of cost per use. But we know that 25% of the titles in these packages don't get any use at all. So the question is, are we subsidizing that kind of material? And are we doing it for tenure purposes? Could we do it better with subscriptions or with author page charges? Are these viable alternatives for interlibrary loan in the future? With individual journals, we know things like, is it the current year that's being used? Is it the embargo period that's an issue? Are there back years and archives? These kind of information points are available through the resolvers, but we're not capturing that, and we're not looking at it to decide which types of subscriptions we need to buy based on user behavior. Aggregators, we know that there are publishers that come and go in these tools, so tracking that is interesting. There's selective coverage even within aggregators. There's the basic plan, the complete plan, the elite plans, and each of those have different packages in them. There's things like JSTOR that's an aggregator that skews your results, because if somebody's only searching JSTOR, then they're not seeing all the other material that they might use. And if we use evidence-based decision-making, then we're going to cut some of those other things if you keep telling people to just go to JSTOR first. So behaviors drive decision-making. ILL, we've got reciprocal issues. We know there are hidden costs. We'll come back to that. We know there are response time issues. We know these kind of things can be customized for different populations. Pay-per-view options, we have, again, the ability to customize those by discipline, by user type, a lot of other ways that we can look at it. Even how valuable is that delay for a user? Can you cut things knowing that there won't be a delay? And then the last things are the non-library data, some of which we know. We talked about the direct to the publisher issue. Those sometimes we can count, but all of that wildcard stuff, the illegal channels that we'll never be able to find out about, those are the kind of things that maybe customer surveys could be used to find that kind of information. So in preparing for the next part, the question is, can we shift the paradigm? Can we move from just in case to just in time? And will that be an acceptable turnaround time given all the new technologies? What does a subscription mean anymore in terms of the resolver connections that look seamless and immediate? What is acceptable or not? We'll come back to that in a minute. And then there are all kinds of questions about changing how and when you pay for something if it's an alternative channel as opposed to a subscription. There are Contu guidelines and other issues that we'll talk about next. So let me turn it over now to the more philosophical aspects of these questions.
I think in some of the conversations we had about this topic, that the paradigm shift of the change from just in case to just in time is a big shift for a lot of us. I know that Susan's in the chat talking about how she needs her patrons often want it in 24 hours. Whereas I stopped and I was thinking about all the articles we deliver internally, all the DocDel articles that come in and sit for, if it's a Saturday, sit till Monday, when we can fill them. Like, that's adding time to those requests. So it's not really instantaneous, even though we have instantaneous. And if we think about that model of like, okay, well, it still took me 6 hours to deliver something that we had access to, like, that does change it a little bit more to just in time, or the availability as opposed to just in case. Like, we have resources that people aren't able to find. They don't use our catalog to find. And so they're still waiting for ILL to give it to them.
Right. After all, a really big, I think a big appeal of subscriptions is the consistency. You know what you have the ability to plan for your budget. But a lot of that appeal is really vanishing between sort of unpredictable embargoes, between new articles that are not necessarily available immediately, and between the rapidly rising subscription costs, which can be extremely unpredictable. A lot of that appeal is really going away. There are many different alternatives. As David talked about some of the non-library ones, there are also, my nearby colleagues at Amherst College have actually had very good experiences using a token model, where instead of having a subscription where a user clicks through immediately to an article, they get met with a prompt that says, hey, you can get this article immediately, but it costs the library something. Do you really want to proceed? Of course, their usage went way down below where the publisher had previously been reporting for them. But as far as they're aware, right, their patrons are still getting exactly what they want very immediately. That model isn't for everyone. And even if we can get things in 24 hours, ILL is pretty good at getting the majority of our things in 24 hours these days, unless it's something very obscure, in which case I think patron expectation is still that it would take longer. But there are accreditation requirements that require a certain level of access. So how does a really fast turnaround time play into those kinds of requirements? We also know our users do have an expectation to get materials immediately, especially if they're panicked and working on something with a nearby due date, right? If their paper deadline is 8 a.m. the next day, 24 hours is not going to serve them. We also know that different disciplines may have different expectations. A big thing for me here, so as I said, I'm a resource sharing librarian. I focus on interlibrary loan. What copyright law says is that if we borrow articles such that they substitute for a subscription, we need to pay licensing fees for those articles. Right now, as you may be aware, there are some really, really big discussions in interlibrary loan about what that should actually look like. Since 1976, we've been using the Cantu guidelines, which say if you borrow more than 5 articles that have been published within the last 5 years. But I don't know about you, but if I'm looking at subscription counter data, that doesn't look like a subscription to me, right? We still need fair guidelines. We need consistent guidelines. Those guidelines might look different university to university, but we have to think really carefully about what that actually means in compliance with law and in compliance with accreditation and with what our users need most immediately.
Especially when you think about some of these journals cost as much as a car. In that case, 5 uses is not really replacing subscription. So there's some very different kinds of considerations.
Yeah, I think that Cantu is a guideline that gets repeated a lot in conferences these days, is really important because it is a guideline, and it is a guideline that is very outdated. Personal opinion, I guess.
I highly agree, and I really encourage folks, if you haven't already, take a look at some of the work done by Georgetown and by Ohio State University. They're doing some fantastic work about sort of the history. What could a new model look like?
Yeah, a $30 copyright fee that, for my 6 article is a lot different than a $10,000 fee for a subscription, or more.
Of course, there's always the issue that if most libraries cancel that expensive journal. The few that remain won't be able to afford it because the prices will quadruple. And so there's a inherent tautology in reciprocal ILL at some point where you cannot rely on just a few libraries to serve everyone if they're going to maintain the commercial skim for the publisher.
Absolutely. And beyond that, there's this delicate ecosystem, right? If a publisher ups their prices just enough that pretty much all libraries lose that subscription, then nobody's going to be able to get at it. The journal isn't going to be able to survive either. Everybody loses.
And I think it also, with the small publishers, that those subscriptions really can make a difference. It's not, for the society ones. And it's hard because those sometimes are the easy ones to cut because they're very, they're not in a package, they're not in this, they don't have the extra things. But that can also mean that we're all losing a great resource. Is there...
All right. Do we have any, we haven't had any audience participation yet, or it may just be that I'm not seeing it's there and I'm not seeing it.
I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. So how would we
Can we move to the next slide too? Because there's another aspect.
Sure. Yeah.
So then it comes also with this question about whose needs will be met. If we are looking at different subscriptions and different ways of having access, should different disciplines be treated differently? I worked in a medical library for a little bit. There was an expectation very much there that things that were needed for surgery or research, were within less than 24 hours, often 2 hours. And there might be other disciplines that don't need that quick turnaround. They might be able to do a 24, 48, maybe a little bit longer, especially considering if something's hard to find. I think that the immediacy, sometimes it's like, how immediate is this for you, is a good query for patrons, because we always, I think we all know when it is the last week of the semester and I know that everyone needs their articles that week, but mid-semester, maybe there's different expectations of when they could get things. And then should access be based on patron status? Faculty, grad, undergrad sometimes have different privileges. I know that, my institution, the cost of what we're willing to spend at reprints or another institution is different than for a faculty member than it is for an undergrad. With an undergrad, we maybe do some instruction in the middle to say, like, do you need this, or, would this other article work? And what is the minimum number of subscriptions to maintain a viable ILL network? We discussed this a little bit with the last slide, but Interlibrary Alone is a community, and it's built on the idea of like, if I don't have it, then you will have it, or someone else will have it. What happens when there is only one person that has it? Not only is it very expensive, it's very laborious for their staff, possibly, to fulfill all those requests. And we're leaning on one institution to do all of that heavy lifting. And then when would open access journals be acceptable as a replacement to commercial journals? Like, how do we include more of the open access journals into our discovery, into our different systems, so that people do have that immediate access? How do we talk about that even? How do we encourage our faculty to understand that? It's Susan was talking about outreach for Interlibrary Loan, but the IR also needs out, the institutional repository needs outreach. Everything needs outreach to help people understand how they make their material discoverable in a free legal way, or a legal free way.
And it might even be that the library is involved in influencing the industry. Let's take something like dance, where there's not a lot of money involved in the discipline. Maybe in that area, we want to move the journals, if possible, to an open access approach, where it's not behind a commercial firewall, because it can't support that kind of a thing as easily. So there may be discipline-specific changes to the publication process itself, not just to the delivery and filtering of requests.
Yes, and I know, like, for the different disciplines be treated differently. for a lot of our science, they write into their grants that, you know, the libraries, you know, we need this money for the library or for research. And so they're going to have an expectation of what is available to them that's different than school that doesn't necessarily help the library get grant money. Like it can be a tricky thing to balance. I think that's what, when we were talking about this, like balance came up a lot of, like, how do you balance these needs, patron needs, library needs, community needs against each other to do this successfully.
Now, the beauty of the new tools that exist in the resolvers are you can customize them far more than you ever did before. So I can say, for this journal, for this time period, for this type of patron, I will go directly to a seamless document delivery company. But for other people or other years, I will go through reciprocal ILL. And so I now can, to some extent, tailor the service. What I don't have is a predictable cost model yet. And that's the other part of what I need. I need to know that if I am prioritizing the chemistry department because I canceled their journal package, I am watching the use so that mid-year, if I need to, I can cut it down and move some of the journals or all of them back to reciprocal if I need to. So that flexibility, customization, and the ability to monitor if you don't have tokens is a really important aspect of it. As we move from just in case to just in time, that constant monitoring and revising is going to become more and more important for us.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead. You go ahead first.
There's an interesting comment in the chat about from Jean Rick that she's at an undergrad institution. For us, it is discipline. We have paid for publisher rapid delivery of expensive science stuff because we can't afford any of it. However, the humanities, we continue to rely on ILL, which takes longer.
Mm.
That still comes back to the same question. How quickly do they really need that item? I mean, there is an ability to put a rush option on for something that's really necessary, and those go through commercial. But if you're not declaring it a rush, they don't all have to be treated the same. So in some cases, you can say, yes, we pay more, or there's more cost involved in science. That doesn't mean it has to be reciprocally as expensive to get every item either.
Right. I think that this is also a big part of the outreach that we're trying to do is just to get people to start going through the libraries, or to make the libraries their default, because that allows us to use that data to figure out if we should be subscribing to something.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're seeing, yeah, okay, maybe this is the humanities, but you're getting a ton of articles from this one particular journal. Perhaps even the licensing fees that we're having to pay do approach a subscription cost. Or we're seeing that you're making high use of a particular title, and there are a lot of delays involved. That then makes a very good case for getting a subscription to that item.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a point in time where getting new subscriptions is obviously going to be very, very difficult. We need a lot of good justification for that. So it's almost a way of voting with your use. And that's a piece of the outreach that we're trying to do with our faculty.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it is really difficult to do that. We've had, when we're canceling journals, we've had faculty who say, no, I use this all the time. And we're saying that the use doesn't show that. And it turns out they're already using a personal subscription or a subscription from another university that they're affiliated with. So that can really blow a hole in things, as well as, I think one way that something that we lose when we lose subscriptions is people's ability to browse beyond abstracts.
So
and that, yeah, go ahead.
There's an aspect of that we need to talk about also. Use is not necessarily critical use. We did something that was absolutely counterintuitive and found it fascinating. We canceled a major index that was a subject index. And when we told people to switch to the more generic tool, we found that our interlibrary loans went down tremendously but the satisfaction didn't have any hit at all. So people were thrilled to find things that were there already, and were actually more satisfied that they didn't have to ask for things that they didn't know they should probably have not asked for to start with. So when you are looking, especially in an academic world where you don't have to have the perfect and every answer, sometimes the use studies don't show what's best used. It just shows what happened to show up in the first 5 results that they clicked on. By changing the tool they use, you can still satisfy them equally well, but not generate as much ILL. And we found that to be true as we cancel more and more subject indexes and present only the results that are immediately available first. Our satisfaction levels have gone up while our ILL numbers have gone down and our costs have gone down. So it's a fascinating, counterintuitive, but very interesting study.
Mm-hmm.
I think it speaks to the importance of discovery layers also, because I know that is one of the things sometimes when you're watching some of the requests come in on Interlibrary Loan, and you're like, I can see that, I know, especially like with some of the freshman classes, I know what you're looking for and I know why you're requesting this and I understand, but you really are just like, oh, well, it's here, so I'm going to click it. And then do I need, you're like, they don't need it. And that they do end up, even if they get the article, somehow a little like unsatisfied with the process in the library, because it was like, oh, well, this didn't actually really help me, or it took too long. I really just needed it for this paper. And so it's trying to, I think, work with all of these other departments in your university. It's like, there's a comment about acquisitions and other things where it's like, it's not just about understanding the metrics. It's about like, sometimes it's also understanding like, well, this is why they're clicking on it.
Absolutely. We at UMass a while back, when our discovery layer switched from being WorldCat to being EBSCO Discovery Service, our loan requests went down enormously just because those weren't coming up, right?
Yeah.
And even now, a lot of what our office does is connect patrons to resources that are already in the libraries that are still not coming up in their discovery searches. And we chose that, we decided that it made the most sense. We're still going to connect them. Their information is going to say, hey, did you know this was actually available here? But we're going to connect them directly to it because it implies to us that there's been some difficulty landing there. I think in those ways, ILL can really serve as this canary in a coal mine. It can help us identify where our discovery layer flaws in uncovering the holdings that we already have and can supply immediately. Where are there departments where that's happening a lot? Or is it, is that faculty who are making these same things? Who, they could have actually accessed it immediately, but instead they wind up waiting a day until we see their request. Because also, right, in a world where the library actually has everything the patron needs, we would actually see very low interlibrary loan rates. We would only see that for those really fringe, difficult, weird items, right? But I feel like it's a kind of perfectly positioned place to figure out where are those needs and where are those connection problems happening.
So one of the things that we've done recently is we put a new link in our resolver. So if you get a borrow from other libraries option, before that, there's something that says Google locate with a question mark. And we found that about 50% of the time, our users can find it immediately on the web for free, and they don't go to ILL anymore. And they like it because the library has helped them find something they would not have been able to find on their own. So it's moving us more into the seamlessly integrated option for things that are outside of our own purchasing. And that's a really key thing. What you can also do is you can customize the results and even the databases based on who you are. So if you log in through Shibboleth, we can say if you're a freshman or a sophomore, you go to, say, Academic Search Complete, and you'll be satisfied with what we offer you. But if you're a junior or a senior, you're going to go to the central index, and you're going to have a lot more ILL requests that are going to come up. But we can tailor where you go and your satisfaction to some extent based upon who you are in a way we weren't able to do before.
I think that a lot of these points speak to things that are going on in the chat as well about outreach and making sure you're communicating these things, because that is the reality. Like if you cancel something, change something, whatever, without notifying people, you will hear about it and you will have people that are unhappy. it's, I think, to me, I took a look, I understand the point of outreach. It's something that I believe in with ILL, but it is also an interesting fit sometimes with ILL, where it's like, oh, I forgot I've got to communicate all these changes and I've got all these things that are happening. And how do you talk about something kind of like, not as abstract, ILL isn't abstract, but it's behind the curtain often.
Well, and the other part of it is, I think that we're always worried about the faculty's reaction to change. The students don't really have that much of a problem with change. They're used to constant change. It's the faculty that don't want to change the links in their pages and don't want to change the look of the interface, even though it's a better interface. So the other thing is, I saw one about equity, and is this an equity issue? Equity doesn't have to be one thing. Equity can be based upon the need of the individual. So if the individual needs it for a grant, they get a higher immediacy rate. Whereas if they just need it for a paper, no matter what subject you're in, your equity changes based upon your need. And so little checkboxes on the ILO form that says, need within 24 hours is going to be a good way to deal with equity, rather than trying to just make it equitable immediately for everyone.
Although I do find those kinds of checkboxes can be really dangerous, because patrons don't always understand that expressing that desire, that need, or they'll think that, they'll say I need within a time. Some of them are doing it because they actually have a deadline. Some of them are doing it because they just rather have something tomorrow. And they apply that across the board to articles that are, major publications owned by many, many institutions, and like a 15th century manuscript held by one library in Italy. And so you really do have to set some expectations about what that means and what process those types of requests go through. We always at UMass try to get through any queue by the end of the day. We're trying to process everything very quickly, and things with enough information can be near instantaneous. If, say they included the ISSN and it matches something in a rapid open access database, right? That's going to happen like this. But that same request, if they didn't include an ISSN and they submit it on Friday night, they're not going to see it until Monday, no matter how many rush this request buttons they click, even though they could have had it immediately if they'd looked in the right place.
So
right?
that's education and a service contract that's clear to people what the expectations will be. Absolutely necessary.
Yep. We've also had this kind of issue with language. We ultimately removed, we used to have an item in our request form about whether people would accept, what language someone would accept an article in. And then we started hitting a lot where a lot of them were Korean or Chinese articles that had English abstracts. Patrons found the abstract, they requested the article, and it came in right away without staff intervention. It did come very fast as they wanted, but the article had never been published in any other language. It had never been published in English. And then you get patrons going, what the heck, I clicked the button, I said what I wanted, right? So you have to be really careful with with how that education works and what options you're allowing them and what those options actually mean.
No, and I think
I'd like to,
go ahead, Scott.
the topic of outreach has come up a couple of times in the chat. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to bring us back to that for a second. I'm curious if anybody here has comments regarding some outreach success stories, maybe recommendations for outreach best practices.
I think that for us, the way outreach happens is we go out to the departments and say, we're about to make some cancellations. Let's talk about priorities. That's the clear outreach that they hear, understand, and engage in. Anything that isn't about immediacy and their personal need probably isn't going to get nearly as much attention. Unfortunately, we've been in a situation where that's the conversation we've been having regularly. So relative values, costs, those are all things that they need to understand before they can accept the compromises that we're offering.
And if you've planned ahead and made a decision that, okay, here's some journals we're going to cancel. I'm sure there are going to be some faculty members who will not be happy with that, but we've planned ahead. We've figured out what some alternative access models are going to be for this content. Have you had success in that sort of outreach?
I've been starting to think about that as we're coming to try and figure out some cuts of how, instead of we frame it as necessarily cuts, like, yes, you won't maybe necessarily have it within 5 seconds, but you'll have it within 24 hours. You know, for faculty, we will buy articles for you. We will make sure that you still have a way of getting it. It may just be a slight change in your expectations. And to me, it's perpetually hammering what an SSN is. I'm like, just put the SSN in and we'll get it for you. But I think it is, it's about not just educating and doing outreach to the faculty in different departments. It's about also doing education and outreach to my colleagues who are liaisons to that. It's that I need them to be able to say, well, yes, you might get it within 24 hours, but if you don't, it's because it's been checked against 300 plus libraries. It's probably this, and that I realized that a year ago or so, that was on, I've been in my position about 2 years, and I had to go back and restart the education process because that helps manage the expectations.
And I think the other thing that really helps is we've had a couple of cases where we've had to cancel packages in areas, and we told them, we will take the top ones and we'll put them through seamless commercial document delivery, and we'll come back and look at the use data with you next year. And we'll see if you really needed them or not. And half the time, they didn't get enough use, and that we were able to then calm them down to the point where we're able to move most of those away, knowing that it would really be quite all right most of the time.
Yeah,
so
very
evidence-based education process.
Yeah, very similarly, when UMass canceled our big deal with the Royal Society of Chemistry Publishers, what they did was they did a combo. This was actually just before I started my my role. They were both surveying faculty for the top titles. They were looking at usage data, and they did individually subscribe to those top journals. And then they promised to keep evaluating. And that's like the first thing when I started my position, is they said, we really, really need you to do a lot of evaluation of these specific journals. And that was also in collaboration with the liaison librarian for those departments. So I think that those, it's not something that I necessarily could have, like on my own, I can absolutely give tons of data about how many times something was used, right? But I can't compare that to what like a faculty member's actual experience is, or that communication, that relationship with them that makes it worthwhile.
So the question just came up is the unpredictability of costs if we start to use these alternatives. There are ways to cap costs, or at least monitor them and reduce them if they run out of control. Some people use tokens. I don't know if either of you have experience with tokens. Okay. We don't use tokens, but we go through a commercial vendor who tells us, well, we set things automatically. For faculty, the first 5 go through reciprocal ILL, the next 20 go through commercial. We get notified when it hits 15, so we start to look at these things and decide whether we're going to switch it back to reciprocal or not. And then we look at them each year and say, did any of these journals get used enough that we switch them back to a subscription? So it's an annual review that is ultimately some sort of cap on the speed with which something is delivered more than anything else. And there are a variety of models out there that are being used to try and let you at least monitor and make changes mid-year if that's what you need to do.
I think that that point also goes to what you can automate, and then what comes into the labor aspect of, while we're automating some things, there is still other labor that's added, because if it's going out seamlessly, I need to set up the stop so I can check it and then switch it back. And that management of this system ends up being a lot of what the labor is.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's a big hidden cost, right? Because as we also build more complex system, more places that we're checking for things in, those are low labor in that when they're working right, you get these beautiful near instantaneous connections. But it takes it takes labor and it takes knowledge to maintain all of those systems.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there are hidden costs just through reciprocal ILL too. I think I saw a study that said it's like $30 per article if you take into the costs of the staff and everything else involved too. So you have to put that into the equation. So the other question was, how do you do future budgeting for 2 to 3 years out with these kinds of access things? I would love to know how to do any budgeting 2 to 3 years out, other than saying 5% cut every year and figure out where to find the actual dollars. I mean, that's the level I'm looking at. I need to find money each year. I need to cancel enough to just cover inflation. There's no way to say I'm going to be able to continue as is anyway. So all of these are just allowing me to be a little bit more reactive and proactive in canceling. I'm never expecting to have more or even a zero-based budget in the future. That's just not going to happen. But I can know what my general costs are going to be and analyze annually what I need to modify one way or the other.
And I think that if you're thinking about it, you know, you can look at what articles or what are, you know, you might replace, and then look at copy, you know, what is copyright for that? You know, if we go past 5, you're not going to get an exact cost, but you'll be able to kind of average it out per month or per year to get an idea of like, all right, I think we'll spend in this ballpark, assume some sort of increase over the next few years, although that's not climbing as much as journal subscriptions climb. So
that's actually a good point. Is there can be with some journals a pretty big chunk of variation in what their copyright costs are at any point in time, but I think you're right that increase is smaller than a subscription, and not just because of the scale, right? But like that percentage of increase may on average be smaller than a subscription's percentage of increase. And I hadn't say, you know, so we're at UMass, we are looking at moving away from the Cantu model, and we're figuring out how to do kind of a holistic evaluation that would bring in more of this evaluation for when should we be subscribing to something, when should we be paying licensing fees. And at least in the past, you know, the amounts that we're paying for licensing fees under Cantu were pretty reliable. It was within a ballpark. Where that money was going did shift. It shifted between whether we were doing reprints desks and CCC, but the ballpark of that total sum was quite close year to year.
And when we're talking about Cantu and other issues, if we're looking at 2 to 3 years down the line budget issues, we may not need to be paying as much in Cantu in the future as we are now. So that could be reallocated back to other things. But that's a topic for another session, I'm sure.
Well, and speaking of which, we've only got 1 minute left here. Let me just take another look at the chat and see if, nope, there've been no new questions. You know, this is truly, I think, truly been a lively discussion. And I don't know if I can speak for the other participants here, but I know, speaking for myself, if any of the participants, if any of the audience members didn't get a chance to ask a question that you were hoping to ask, feel free to contact me directly. I think my contact information should be available. Any final thoughts from the participants?
Yeah, likewise, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk ILL and copyright till the cows come home.
Yeah, and we didn't expect answers. We expected more quizzical, you know, looks at the end of the session, which is what generally happens in these meetings.
Exactly, and I did want to point out that Karen put the white paper for the ARL Cantu guidelines into the chat if you want to do some extra reading. So thank you, Karen.
All right, thank you so much for joining, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good to have you all here.
Bye.